All right, let's jump right into one of Jesus's most powerful and honestly challenging stories, the parable of the unmerciful servant from Matthew chapter 18. It is a really profound story all about forgiveness, with a lesson that hits just as hard today as it did 2,000 years ago. So, Jesus kicks things off right here in verse 23. He paints this picture of the kingdom of heaven being like a king who decides it's time to settle his accounts. Now, this isn't just some casual bookkeeping. Think of it more like a day of reckoning where everything is about to be brought out into the open.
This whole parable doesn't just come out of nowhere. It's actually Jesus' answer to a question from Peter, who basically asked, hey, how many times do I have to forgive someone who keeps messing up? So Jesus uses this powerful image of a king settling his debts to explain the very heart of God's kingdom and the absolutely crucial role forgiveness plays in it.
And right away, in verse 24, we meet our first guy. A servant gets hauled in front of the king, and it turns out he owes a debt that is so massive, so completely staggering, it's almost hard to even imagine. This debt is really the core conflict of the entire story.
Okay, so to really feel the punch of what happens next, we have to wrap our heads around the sheer size of this debt. And I mean really wrap our heads around it. Jesus didn't just pick a big number. He picked a number that was designed to sound completely and utterly impossible to pay back. The scripture says the amount was 10,000 talents. Now, a talent wasn't like a coin you'd carry around. It was the single largest unit of currency they had. It was a measurement of weight, usually of a precious metal like gold or silver. So 10,000 of them. We're talking about a fortune that is just beyond comprehension. And when you see the numbers side by side like this, wow, the contrast is just shocking. That first stat, the 10,000 talents, was the equivalent of about 60 million denarii. In today's money, that's something like $7 billion. It's meant to symbolize our infinite, unpayable sin debt to God. And the second debt we're about to see, a measly 100 denarii, maybe $12,000 today. It represents the small, everyday offenses we commit against each other. The difference is just astronomical. So, facing this impossible situation, what does the servant do? Well, verse 26 tells us he does the only thing he can do. He just collapses. He falls to his knees, completely desperate, and begs the king for patience, making this totally hollow promise. I'll pay it all back. But he knows it's impossible, and the king knows it's impossible. And then, something absolutely incredible happens in verse 27. This is the pivot point of the whole story. The king, moved not by the guy's empty promise, but just by pure compassion, does something radical. He doesn't set up a payment plan. He doesn't give him more time. He cancels the entire thing. The whole $7 billion debt, gone. Wiped clean in a single, breathtaking act of grace. So this is where the story takes a turn, right? The servant is free, he's unburdened, he's just been given this unbelievable gift. But now comes the real test. Is the mercy he just received going to change how he treats other people? Well, according to verse 28, the very first thing this forgiven servant does is go out and hunt down someone who owes him money. And remember that chart? We're talking about the 100 denarii debt. It's nothing, a microscopic fraction of the debt that was just erased for him. And get this, the hypocrisy is just stunning. In verse 29, his fellow servant does the exact same thing he did. He falls down at his feet and begs for mercy, using the very same words. Have patience with me, and I will pay you back. It's a perfect echo. It's the perfect opportunity for him to pass on the compassion he was just shown. But does he? No way. The language in verses 28 and 30 is just brutal. It says he grabbed him and began to choke him, demanding the money right now. And when the poor guy can't pay, the servant, who was just forgiven billions, has him thrown into prison. There's no grace, no compassion, just cold, hard, violent enforcement. But an act of cruelty like that doesn't just happen in a vacuum. Verse 31 says that other servants saw the whole thing go down, and they were horrified. So they go back and report everything to the king, which sets up this parable's dramatic and, frankly, terrifying conclusion. Now, to really get why throwing him in prison was such a big deal, you have to understand the two legal systems they were living under at the time. Jewish law was all about mercy. It even commanded that all debts be canceled every 7 years. But Roman law, it was harsh, it was unforgiving, and it absolutely allowed for debtor's prison. So when the king's punishment, in verse 34, uses that phrase, delivered him to the tormentors, He's invoking that brutal Roman system. This wasn't a temporary punishment. See, if you're in prison, you can't work, which means you can't ever earn the money to pay off the debt. It was a sentence without an end, a totally hopeless situation. When the king calls the unmerciful servant back in, his question in verse 33 just cuts right to the heart of everything. He connects the dots perfectly. Shouldn't you have had compassion on your fellow servant, just as I had pity on you? It wasn't a suggestion, it was the fundamental expectation that came with the grace he'd received.
And now, this is where Jesus brings it all home. He pivots from the story and turns its moral into a direct warning. This isn't just a story about some guys a long time ago. It's a spiritual principle with real, eternal consequences for every single person listening, then and now.
And here's the key takeaway, the real gut punch of the parable. The greater sin here isn't whatever small offense was committed against us. The greater sin is withholding forgiveness from someone else after we ourselves have been forgiven in infinite debt by God. To do that is to basically reject the very mercy that we are so desperate for. Jesus ends the whole thing in verse 35 with this crystal clear, totally unavoidable application. This story isn't just a nice illustration, it's a condition. Our own forgiveness from God is directly, inextricably linked to our willingness to forgive other people. And not just saying the words, but forgiving them from your heart. And that leaves us with a really heavy question to sit with, doesn't it? This parable forces us to look in the mirror and ask ourselves, if we've truly been forgiven an unpayable billion-dollar debt by God, what small $12,000 debts are we still clutching onto, refusing to let go of in our own lives?